We've had written history for 5,000 years, right? People have been generally literate for less than 500 years. But we've had culture for 150,000 years. Identifiable culture for at least 25,000. So the vast period of our enculturation was pre-literate enculturation, before we could write down the rules and transmit them. How were they transmitted, assuming we had culture? Well, there's a variety of mechanisms. We have a tendency to see elements of the world in personified form because most of the interrelationships we have with the world are actually social or interpersonal relationships. So that's basically how our brain is structured. And as we evolved, we developed the capacity to extend our cognitive ability beyond the merely social to take in the world as such. But the categories that we used to do that were still fundamentally social. Now, the reason the unknown per se is symbolized is its capacity to generate new forms. And the unknown as such is logically and appropriately symbolized by the feminine because it's the bringer forth of all things, which is to say that the background of existence, the unknowable background of existence, is the thing that generates everything. Paired with that, of course, according to the schema that we've been working with, is the archetype of the Great Father. And the archetype of the Great Father is the archetype of tradition, fundamentally. The great weight of the past. Because as you incorporate your past, the past of your culture, through the intermediation of your parents, you learn routines and rituals for structuring the unknown. Now, those routines and rituals are patterns of action that you use in the world as such, and also complex patterns of action that you use to structure your own interpretations and your own motor output and your own conceptualizations when you're dealing with other people. And so that would be the in you essentially keeps chaos at bay, which means if two of you share the same cultural structure, assuming you're playing the same game, so to speak, that means that you can each predict each other's responses, which is very, very useful because that way you can be sure that you can trust the other person. You can more or less infer their goals, because after all, their value structure is similar to yours, and if you can infer their goals, that means you can embody their emotions. So that's the benevolent aspect of tradition, right? The part that protects and shelters you and structures the nature of your being in the face of existential terror and doubt, so to speak. But there's also an aspect of tradition that's terrible, tyrannical. It's the part that marches young men off to war, say, in defense of the structures that it's protecting. It's the part that says, when you're a teenager, wear this and not this, or you'll be the target of mockery for all your peers. It's the part of the structure that crushes the creative life out of you because the off to war, say, in defense of the structures that it's protecting. It's the part that says, when you're a teenager, wear this and not this, or you'll be the target of mockery for all your peers. It's the part of the structure that crushes the creative life out of you because the tyrannical aspect of social order doesn't want your creative life, so to speak. What it wants is your obedience, because your obedience is what makes the machine run smooth. And so you're always in an ambivalent relationship with regards to security, to authority. On the one hand, it provides you shelter and what you need and allows you to gain the benefits of literally thousands and thousands of years of cultural evolution. On the other hand, it's the thing that makes you obey or face the painful consequences thereof, which can range from mere social exclusion and consequent re-exposure to the unknown to truly oppressive practices designed to make you be exactly like everyone else or else. Thereof, which can range from mere social exclusion and consequent re-exposure to the unknown to truly oppressive practices designed to make you be exactly like everyone else or else. And so you could say, most particularly, again, that's a standard existential problem. It's a problem that's faced by people in every place and in every culture, balancing the appropriate attitude towards culture. So the most fundamental representation of culture can be portrayed essentially in this manner, I think. And what you see here is the dragon of chaos, of course, lurking in the background. And what that means is that all forms come from the formless, and that the Father itself is a primary form, a representation of God the Father. And God the Father in the Christian Trinity is the representation of the positive and, well, better listen to those rules. If you don't, all hell's going to break loose. And you know, that's a pretty reasonable summary of how things work, unfortunately. So on the one hand, God offers security, on the other hand, he offers tyranny, and in total that basically represents order. So you can see this representation is quite useful. It shows God standing over this city, which of course is a city committed to him fundamentally. So it operates under the moral principles that he represents, and behind him is a representation of the sun, which is partly a representation of the source of all life, partly a representation of the source of consciousness and illumination, right? Because you're conscious during the day, and partly a halo representing the sort of transcendent nature of the social order that structures existence. So it's a primary phenomenon, and it's only to say that in all human experience there's a cultural aspect and a natural aspect, and the funny thing is the cultural aspect is our very nature. We're beneficiaries and victims. And so then, just as is the case with the feminine, there's two aspects that can be represented metaphorically with regards to the masculine. You can say, well, the secure aspect of social order is the wise king, and you can see a medieval representation of him here, sitting on his throne calmly in a relatively open posture. That means he's ready to listen to supplicants, to people who are coming to talk to him. He's holding an orb with a cross on top of it, which means essentially that he's in control of the world, and that the world is subordinated to something else that's represented by the cross, a wise and just ruler. And then his mirror image here is the sun-devouring king, a very common mythological theme, the father who wants to destroy his son. And there's shades of the Oedipal conflict in that, of course. Nature, every human being is also in the terrible position of facing the fact that their very individuality is likely to be crushed out of them during the socialization process, and that, in a sense, that's really not avoidable. I mean, if you're subject to really tyrannical socialization, it's obviously a much more cardinal problem, right? But even if you're subject to socialization under normal circumstances, you are still what you are, rather than the manifold things that you could have otherwise been. And just to give you some sense of how dramatic a process this really is, one of the things you should know is that you actually die into your brain. So one of the things you might wonder is, why is it that death evolved? It doesn't really make that much sense from a Darwinian perspective, right? Because you'd make the presupposition that if you could just stick around and father children, say, for 250 years, you'd be doing a lot better job than the poor sap who only lived to be 30. So why is it that you only live to be 7? And then you remember, well, the environment's always changing, right, in this chaotic manner that's represented by the Great Mother. Can you change with it? And the answer to that is yes, but only to a certain point, which is why as people age, they tend to become more and more alienated from the current culture, right? They've adopted their position of being, say, which is more or less fixed by the time they're 25 or so, once their prefrontal cortex matures, and then after that the world gets away from them. They don't have enough biological resources left to constantly undergo new revolutionary neurological processes. And part of the reason is this: you have more neural connections in your brain when you're first born than you do for the rest of your life, any other time in your life. And as you learn when you're an infant, and as you learn, say, over the first 2 years, what happens is that there's a plenitude of circuits, and they die off, leaving only those circuits that have a function. And you think about that, your personality, whatever it becomes, what's happening is that the excess possibility, in some sense, is being demolished by experience. So the tyrannical aspect of enculturation is something that's real, because it makes you, in large part, what you are. And you have to understand as well that that's necessary, because it's better to be something. In the final analysis, it's better to be something than to be nothing. But, you know, we still have residual dreams like those expressed by Peter Pan, say, who's the boy that never wants to grow up because he doesn't want to attain any final and fixed form. And it's interesting because in one respect, as you progress through your life, you're climbing, assuming things are going well, you're climbing to ever new heights. But on the other hand, the direction that you're going in constantly narrows as you age. So there's a real trade-off there, and I think the existential angst that's caused as a consequence is real. And I also think that adolescents and early adults feel this most intently, which is part of the reason why they tend to rebel against social structures in general, you know, whether it's the military-industrial complex or the corporate world or globalization or what have you, is that you have these large structures that represent the tyrannical aspect of social being, and it's no wonder that the fact of those structures engenders rebellion. It should. On the other hand, it's also no wonder that structures like that exist, because if they didn't exist, then people would have no way of interrelating their social being, and we would revert back to the sort of Hobbesian state of war where everybody's arms are around everybody else's throat. That doesn't mean the payoff is always good. So, the Freudians, of course, had a real field day with this, and were most fundamentally concerned by it. Now, part of the reason that Freudian psychology has had such an immense impact on Western and world culture is because Freud came along. So, the Freudians, of course, had a real field day with this, and were most fundamentally concerned by it. Now, part of the reason that Freudian psychology has had such an immense impact on Western and world culture is because Freud came along just when classical Judeo-Christian mythological structures were on a serious decline in the West, and Freud stepped in with a secularized mythological version of reality, which said, well, there's nature, and that's the id, right? That's the wild and untamed impulses that spring up from the animal mind, and there's the ego, which is the individual, who's in many ways a pawn of these id-like forces, and then on top of the ego, crushing it down into the id, so to speak, is the superego, which is the internal and external embodiment of social order and morality. So you can see the mythological substructure underlying Freud. Freud said, well, the ego is always being shaped by the superego, and it's always compulsion. It's don't. See the mythological substructure underlying Freud. Freud said, well, the ego is always being shaped by the superego, and it's always compulsion. It's don't. It's always no. It's like Old Testament morality, right? In the incarnation of the Ten Commandments. Whatever you want to do, if it feels good, the probability is high that it's immoral from the perspective of the social world. And you can really see this with children, you know. It's really remarkable to watch them, because my sense is, and I don't think this is just because I'm a particularly tyrannical father, is that children often get in more trouble for having fun than they do for any other reason, because their capacity for unbridled enjoyment is so unbridled that it actually poses a threat to orderly structures. So, you know, if a child really gets in an active mood and is playing a very active game, I mean, especially if they're somewhere between, say, 3 and 5, they can tear your house to shreds in no time flat, and you're always following them around going, no, quiet down, don't do that. And you know, they're smiling away and they're happier than any adult they should be doing. And that's really nasty and horrible, but by the same token, it's absolutely necessary, because if they don't learn to bring their impulses, even their impulses, their ludic impulses, right, their impulses to play, under control, then nobody else can stand them. And if they don't get access to the resources that are in the social world, man, they have one dismal life laid out in front of them. So anyway, so that's an early description of the genesis of the conflict, say, between the ego and the superego. And I just wanted to point that out, because it's not just sex and aggression that gets regulated, right? I mean, we can understand why that might happen, but it's also playfulness and creativity and spontaneity and all the things that we associated with the joy of being that the terrible, tyrannical social structure puts a clamp on. So Jack Panksepp, for example, has recently demonstrated that children, boys, because it's usually boys, who have attention deficit disorder, which is generally diagnosed in the schoolroom, do much better if they're placed on methylphenidate, which is a kind of amphetamine, fundamentally. But normal kids do better on amphetamines too, by the way. They can focus more, and they can pay attention more. Mostly what methylphenidate does is suppress play. So Panksepp's notion is that, well, what's happening with these ADHD kids, hyperactive kids, is they're more playful, more boisterously playful, which tends to be a masculine attribute in the juvenile forms of many mammals. They're boisterously playful. Give them a little methylphenidate, that shuts down their play behavior, and they can sit down and focus, you know. And well, you can understand how, even if you might think that's necessary, because apparently many people do, you can also still understand that by the same token, that probably represents some kind of loss, right? Because we like to see kids play, and it's good for them besides. So Anyways, Freud says the ego pops up, it's all thrilled to death with the world, the superego comes along and shuts it down, and that's a fate that befalls all of us. And not only that, because Freud's a pretty wise man, all things can see kids play, and it's good for them besides. So anyways, Freud says the ego pops up, it's all thrilled to death with the world, the superego comes along and shuts it down, and that's a fate that befalls all of us. And not only that, because Freud's a pretty wise man, all things considered, he doesn't say that's all to the bad, he says that's the price we pay for social being, and fair enough. You see this happening in children all the time, where part of what they do as they mature is to adopt roles. So they'll play being a father or being a mother, say, and what they're doing is pulling in what they see as the world view that characterizes parenthood, embodying the father, playing out the role, and trying to organize their motivational structures within the observed framework, say, that the father provides. And that's an introjection of social wisdom. If you can imagine that the role of father, say, has a structure, like one structure would be, well, if you're a father and you're around often enough so that you can be a target of modeling, and so you can imagine that the spirit of the father that's modeled, at least in the optimal circumstances, is one that deals out rules and order, but that also provides nurturing care and support, and that's a kind of story. We know fathers who aren't like that, and maybe we know fathers who are too much like that, but all things considered, on the average, you have a father role, and children attempt to interject that.